Okay, welcome back to the Lifespan Development Series. In this particular lecture, I'm going to talk about socio-emotional development in early childhood. So let's begin. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is the sense of self, right? So when we talk about Erik Erikson, we're now looking at ages 3 to 5. So we're dealing with intuitiveness versus guilt. So the previous lecture on social development, we talked about trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Now we're starting to develop, an awareness of how things work, coming up with creative or novel outcomes. That's assuming that we develop a sense of intuition. We could also develop a sense of guilt. So let's march through. I said when we first talked about Erik Erikson that each stage is somehow building on the next or is linked to the next. So successful development in an earlier stage predisposes success at a later stage, and lack of mastery of a stage predisposes failure at or lack of mastery at a later stage. So trust versus mistrust. So if you develop the sense of trust, that means you believe that the world is an orderly, safe, predictable place. You trust the world around you. Then you could develop a sense of autonomy, which is feeling trust in oneself, a sense of developing being self-governed, making one's own decisions. Now, that predisposes this stage of being able to take the information you have and create novel outcomes. And I'm going to give an example afterwards. But let's look at the flip side. If you develop mistrust or doubt of the world around you, you might learn to doubt yourself. You might feel guilty about not performing and generating new information. So each one is linked to the next. Now, you might see intuition or intuitiveness displayed in play practices in kids. For example, in preschoolers, which is early childhood, you might see a kid wearing a pot on their head and a wooden spoon in their hand. And now they say, look at me, mommy, look at me, daddy, I'm a knight in shining armor, right? Whatever it is. Now, what did they do? They took kitchen utensils and created a novel use for them, right? So the pot becomes the helmet of the knight, the ladle becomes the sword of the knight, and all of a sudden they've created a new outcome for a circumstance. That shows some level of creativity, all right, whereas the lack of creativity might come with guilt. All right, now what happens with self-understanding and understand others? So we do develop a representation of the self. We understand who we are at about the age of 3. We have an understanding of our gender. So if a person feels male or they have male genitalia, they understand what that means, and vice versa, right? So if female and whatnot. Now, I will also say people who are not gender binary also start to feel that at this point. So I say males and females. So a person has a penis and they feel and identify as male, great. If a person has a vagina and they feel female, great, right? They're going to have some sense about them as it relates to their gender and societal rules that are connected to their gender. Now, if a person is incongruent with their genitalia and their sense of gender, right? We talk about that as gender dysphoria, right? So it's important to understand that that happens too, and there's an awareness of that. All right. Now, so we have a representation of the self, we understand ourselves, and self representations include bodily attributes, which I talked to you about, material possessions, and physical activities. We also have to talk a little bit about gender typing and gender roles, because society will dictate to a greater degree, without you even knowing, what behavior or physical activities are appropriate or inappropriate. And I put that in quotes based on the macro culture. All right. We also have an understanding of our feelings, our emotions, and our desires, although we don't always accurately report them. And we don't always understand joint commitments. Now, when we talk about emotional development, so emotional development, sorry, this kind of got deleted, so I want to create the space. So emotional development requires you to express, understand, and regulate your emotions, right? So as we get older, we do a better job at, expressing, understanding, and regulating emotions. But we also have a role of the parents. Parents play a role, right? So if you have, and peers play a role, I should say, but let's talk about parents for a second, emotion coaching. So emotion coaching parents, they're going to monitor their children's emotions and use them as opportunities to help them deal with their emotions and regulate their emotions effectively. So these parents allow for their children to experience a wide array of emotions. If they're sad, they talk their children about sadness and sadness being real. If they're crying, they're told it's okay to cry, and they help them process why they're crying. If they're happy, if they're jealous, all of these things we can talk to our children about. Emotion dismissing parents are ones who say, don't cry, don't get upset. So they view their role as to negate any kind of negative emotion. And we also start to see some moral development, which is a development of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in relation to the rules of society. So what are moral feelings? Well, moral feelings from a psychoanalytic theory, they focus on feelings of anxiety and guilt, right? So in a way, we relate or connect or identify with parents to help us reduce anxiety and avoid punishment, right? Now, we also talked about the three parts of personality, the id, the ego, and superego, when we talked about theories. The id was for base desires. The ego was to manage anxiety or regulate the impulses of the id. And then a superego is your moral compass, right? So that's your moral element of personality. Now, it is possible for the id and the superego to run amok. If the id is in overdrive and the ego doesn't regulate it properly, you're going to do a lot of impulsive behaviors. If the superego is in overdrive, it can result in feelings of shame and guilt. Now, when we talk about morality, there are different theories of morality. And at this point in development, according to Piaget, you're in a heteronomous morality, right? So there are three stages. There's heteronomous morality, which is from 4 to 7, transitional phase, which is 7 to 10, and autonomous morality, which is 10 plus, right? So in a heteronomous morality stage, you believe the rules are fixed, unchangeable, you must follow them. So you'll see that it's not uncommon for young children, if their parents say, no, you're going to be in trouble, they're going to listen at the age of 4 to 7. And transition is sort of like a gradual process from moving between heteronomous to autonomous morality. And autonomous morality is a greater recognition that rules and laws are created by people. So what's interesting is we talk about teenagers defying rules or identifying hypocrisy among their caregivers, right? We talk about these things, which to me, I find that really interesting when we think about it, right? Because they have a recognition that the rules were created by people and the rules can be changeable, right? So it's important for them to challenge rules. It's a healthy thing as they're trying to figure out who they are to challenge rules. But what I will tell you is that you can see some of these changes earlier than teenage years. You can see people starting to challenge rules or ask the question, why is the rule what it is, earlier. And even according to Piaget, he was talking about 10 years old. Now, moral behavior. So now we talked about from a personality point of view, id, ego, superego. We talked about from a cognitive point of view with Piaget of morality. Now, moral behavior. Moral behavior is the process of reward, punishment, and imitation. And these three factors play a role in whether you're going to be moral. Reinforcement, by definition, is any outcome or consequence that results in increasing a behavior. Punishment, on the other hand, is any outcome or consequence that results in a decrease of behavior. So the reward and punishment will shape your behavior. But we oftentimes forget that people learn through observation as well and imitation. People copy the behaviors of those they respect, even if the behavior is inappropriate. They will copy it because they respect that person. And it's only if that person is punished or there's a negative consequence to imitation do we stop imitating, right? So we see reward, punishment, imitation are an explanation for why people behave morally. Now, we also talk about self-control, which is the ability to delay gratification. And there's the famous marshmallow test, which was a test of the ability to delay gratification. Now, I will say that marshmallow test has come under question, but I will tell you the test anyway. So if you put a marshmallow on a plate with a young kid, and you ask the kid, hey, you want this marshmallow? They're going to say yes, right? Now, you could tell them, look, you can have this marshmallow now, or you can wait. When I come back, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And the younger the child, the more likely they're going to eat the marshmallow and not wait for 2 marshmallows. And as you get older, you learn to resist temptation, delay gratification, and you're more likely to pass what was called the marshmallow test. Now, to show you that there is a gradient of reinforcement, I'm going to demonstrate it on an adult level. We don't get as influenced by marshmallows at our ages, but we are influenced by money, right? So if I told you that I would give you $100 today or $1,000 at the end of the week. And you could choose either one. Which one are you going to choose? Right? So most of us, because it's not that long of a time, we're going to say, oh, I'll wait till the end of the week to get $1,000, right? We're able to delay gratification. But let me expand the time and see what happens. If I were to say, I'll give you $100 today or $1,000 in a month, what's your choice? Well, you're like, wow, I'm still getting a nice return on my investment. So I might wait the month. I'm still going to be connected with Dr. Kaplan, whether it be in his class or otherwise. So I might wait the month. I'll give you $100 today or $1,000 in a year. Now it's getting a little tougher, isn't it? Right? For some of you, you're like, well, I don't know where you're going to be in a year, and I could find a use for $1,000 now, right? And because I have to wait a year, I don't know if I want to. And notice as the time increases between the choice of 100 to 1,000, it gets harder to not pick the $100. So that's the way it works, right? So we also struggle with delay of gratification at times as well. Now, our conscience, according to this, is our internal regulation mechanism. It tells us what's right and wrong. So, from a social point of view, parenting plays a role in moral development, right? So, your parent-child relationship, trying to avoid potential misbehavior or to stop your kids from doing misbehavior, and having conversations about right and wrong all contribute to moral development. So the stronger the parent-child relationship is, the more they're going to respect you, more they're going to listen to you as you weigh in about morality. The more you teach them at young ages right and wrong and don't allow them to get away with misbehavior, the more likely they're going to engage in moral behavior. And talking about the consequence of action, if there is a misbehavior, having the child understand why they were wrong, why they are punished, is going to be important, right? So parents sometimes want to teach their child right and wrong through punishment. But a punishment is only going to go so far. Most of the time, I encourage a conversation to go alongside the punishment so that the child knows why they're in trouble, right? But all of these play a role. Now, so we talked about morality as such sort of a socio-emotional factor, right? And we talked about how different frameworks explain morality, and we have the biopsychosocial. Now, I also said I develop a gender identity, which I mentioned earlier, which is a recognition of whether one is male, female, or non-binary, right? We also have gender roles. Gender roles are what society tells you how males and females are supposed to think, act, and feel. Gender roles affect everything. It affects how we date. It affects how we dress. It affects the kind of interactions we have with our peers. So we are taught both explicitly and implicitly what males and females are supposed to do. For example, you might have heard the phrase "man up," right? If a male child gets hurt and they start crying, we're going to treat a male child differently than a female child in our society. And I know many of the Scandinavian countries have worked towards a more egalitarian approach than we have. But think about a 3-year-old coming down the slide. We're more likely, I should say, we're not going to, but we're more likely to treat a young girl as a damsel in distress who needs saving or rescuing. So that sends a message that I need to be rescued, or I need to have a knight in shining armor. Whereas males, we might turn around and ignore it to say, oh, foster toughness, man up. Well, that sends a message that we're not allowed to express our emotions. And you can get some things like toxic masculinity as a function of that. So there are issues here. There are issues at play that we need to consider. So the phrase man up is one. You may have also heard a phrase that says, that's not ladylike. So these phrases play a role and affect how we view ourselves. And it affects how we think, act, and feel. We also have gender typing. Parents, even before children can express themselves as it relates to their gender, parents are going to push, on average, towards traditional masculine or feminine roles. For example, let's say you have a 3-year-old birthday party and you want to buy a gift for a young man. What are you going to do? What kind of gift are you going to buy? Are you going to buy a Tonka truck, a tool belt, construction hat? Now, these have been stereotyped as male professions. So implicitly, the child learns that that is something that they're supposed, that's what being masculine looks like. Clothing. The clothing, if you're buying clothing for the party, are you going to buy the kid a dress? If not, why not? Right? So think about these things, because the same thing for a 3-year-old who's female. You're more likely to buy a doll and a stroller and things like that. You're more likely to buy clothes that are dresses in pink and all of these things. So you are typing the child in both overt and implicit ways that you don't even realize you're doing. And most people are harmless when they do this, but it does send a message to a child whether they're supposed to behave in a more masculine or feminine role. Now, we talk about gender, right? Gender and sex are two different things. Your biological sex is based on your chromosomes. Now, gender is more socially constructed. And I want to talk to you a little bit about, we say gender non-binary, right? Because we recognize that it's possible for a person to identify as something other than just male or female. So it's not either or in the gender expression. But what if I told you that even from a biological point of view, it's not binary? And I'm going to talk about the chromosomes, the standard chromosomes, which are XY are male and XX are female. And then the hormone ratio, there's more testosterone to estrogen for males, and then more estrogen and progesterone for females relative to testosterone and in comparison to males. But did you know that on a chromosomal level, it's not just two outcomes? You can have X, that's right, one chromosome, that's Turner's. You could have XX, you could have XXX, you could have XY, you could have XXY, you could have XYY, and you could even have 4 chromosomes, and you get the idea. And these, from a biological underpinning, the chromosomes are not binary. It's not just XX or XY. The standard is XX or XY, but there are deviations from this. Now, the outward expression of genitalia is oftentimes a penis or a vagina, right? And some of these chromosomal pairings, they will result in a penis or a vagina. But even the morphology that comes as a function of your chromosomes. Did you know that it's possible for a person to have both sex characteristics, male and female, a penis and a vagina? So even the morphology, the outward expression of biology, the penis and vagina, you could have both, or you can have a sealed expression that's not fully defined as male or female, penis or vagina. So it's challenging, isn't it? So when we talk about on a chromosomal level, so we're talking about biological influences, just the biological influences on sex and how it impacts how you see gender, right? So from a chromosomal level, it's not binary. From a morphology or genitalia level, it's not binary. And it's also possible that the chromosomes and genitalia might not match, because in week 6 of prenatal development, there's a differentiation process which may not fully occur. So it could be the outward genitalia don't match the chromosomes. Or even if they do match from a gender point of view, one may not feel as though they fit within that body and within that biological expression. And when we talk about that, we're talking about gender dysphoria again. And, biology plays a role. All right. So I talked about the biological influences. I talked about chromosomes. I talked about morphology. I talked about hormones. These are biological influences. Now, evolutionary psychologists focus on these biological factors, and they suggest that because of evolution, some of the psychological differences we have, it's more biologically underpinned through evolution. So males and females are different because they evolved differently. So the human experience resulted in changes in expression. So that in of itself is on the side of biology. Now, when we talk about the social influences, now we're shifting away from the genitalia itself, or the hormones themselves or the chromosomes themselves, and now we're talking about between your ears, how you experience yourself. Like your brain tells you, I don't feel male or I don't feel female. Well, sometimes it matches. Sometimes it, in a cisgender situation, it matches, but it doesn't always match. And society, society will construct what masculinity and femininity is. And that's important to understand, that because now the social influences are loaded towards more the gender rather than the sex piece. All right. Now, when we talk about theories of gender, we have social role theory, which says gender differences resulted in contrasting roles of males and female, right? So it's not just evolution saying the gender differences occur because of how we evolved. Now we have gender differences because of the roles that we put on people. Psychoanalytic theory suggests that, and again, it's a psychosexual theory, but there is attraction to the opposite sex parent, right? Those are understanding of what's happening at this point. And as social cognitive theory, gender development occurs due to observation and imitation. So if you are raised in a house where mom is in a high power executive position, you're going to learn that there's nothing wrong with moms being in high power executive positions. And it's going to chip away at some of the gender roles and gender norms that society has put forth. So, social influences, again, mothers and fathers socialize their children differently. Mothers tend to be more related to nurturing. They tend to be more related to taking care of sick children. Fathers tend to socialize through rough and tumble play. And I think we talk about attachment and how attachment forms this way too, but how we socialize, moms and dads, mothers and fathers socialize differently. But in addition to our parents who play a strong social influence, our peers play a strong influence. So the playground becomes gender school. Now, when you think about elementary school, which is it's right after this lecture, right? So we're talking about elementary school is 5 to about 12. The playground tells a story. Many times males will play with males, females will play with females. It tends to be same-sex groups. So, and then that group will tell you how you're supposed to behave. So we learn from our peers as well. So it's interesting, as we get older, we start to gravitate towards same-sex groups. Now with puberty, this changes again though, right? It changes back to mixed group. But until puberty, your playmates become increasingly same-sex. Now, social cognitive theory, right, on gender, again, gender develops as a function of observation, imitation, reward, and punishment, right? Again, all of the observational strategies and a consequence of observation. Gender schema theory suggests that gender typing emerges as children develop their worldview, and as a function of what they see in the world, they determine what's considered gender appropriate, gender inappropriate. So that's gender schema. Now, we talked about gender. Now let's talk about family and parenting. So Baumrind talks about different parenting styles, and you can put it in sort of a quadrant, right? So in a authoritarian, authoritative, neglectful, which is uninvolved, or indulgent, which is more of a permissive parent. These are the four, right? An authoritarian parent has high demands and tends to be rigid and cold. In Western societies, authoritarian parents result in fear. Their children tend to have more fear of them. Authoritative parents, they have high demands, but it's coupled with warmth. So now this is going to foster curiosity in children and independence in children. Neglectful parents or uninvolved parents, they have low demands on their kids, and they tend to be more cold and dismissive. These parents tend to create resentful children who are defiant in school to get attention because they're being ignored or neglected. An indulgent or permissive parent, they have lots of warmth but low demands. So this is the parent who tries to be overly friendly or be their kid's best friend. This results oftentimes in neediness. So when we think about the parenting styles, authoritative parenting in Western society is viewed as the most ideal, right? Because it tells your child that you have expectations, you expect them to perform, right? So if a kid is getting a C in a class, but they're capable of an A, you let them know. that you expect them to get an A, but you do it with warmth in the following way. Hey, I notice you're struggling in class. Is there anything I can do? Would you like us to get you a tutor? Things like that, if it's possible. Where authoritarian parent, they have high demands. They might yell at the kid. They might beat the kid, things like that. You got to get the A. But it's not done in a compassionate or warm way. Now, historically, the argument has been authoritative parenting has been effective. But what we've found is that there are cross-cultural differences. In Far Eastern communities, authoritarian parenting does not have as negative effects as we once argued. And across different ethnic groups, we see that authoritarian parenting might actually have better outcomes than we have suggested in the past. Now, punishment. So punishment can come in many forms. It could come in the form of timeout. It can come in the form of corporal punishment, spanking. Now, what I will tell you is that you're probably thinking, what's harmful about spanking your children? Well, spanking your children is linked to anxiety, depression, school failure, increased substance use in adolescence, linked to truancy and dropping out of school. So there's a lot of antisocial behaviors that can emerge as a function of corporal punishment. That isn't to say if you spank your child, they're guaranteed, but these are risk factors. So there are other things you could do. I'm not saying let your kid get away with whatever, but you can use things like timeout. And timeout is a highly effective strategy, right? Take things away, take away their phone, take away their car, take away their laptop, take away their TV time, video games, whatever it might be. Find what they like, take it away, or ground them, don't allow them out of the house. These kind of things have the same effect without the psychological damage. So when we talk about corporal punishment, percent remembering and attitudes towards corporal punishment, South Korea and the United States have fairly high relative to European nations in remembering getting spanked. But the attitudes, America has, disproportionately favorable attitudes towards the use of corporal punishment, even though it may actually be harmful. Now, co-parenting. So co-parenting is when two parents have to work together to plan how to effectively get the child to grow up properly. Now, co-parenting happens oftentimes when parents get divorced or separated. Now they're not raising the child in the same home, but strategizing together with the most effective way to raise the child. So co-parenting, if you have good co-parenting, the child's going to blossom. If you have poor co-parenting, the child is at risk of a whole host of factors. So if you have poor coordination between the parents, or one parent undermining the other, lack of warmth or disconnection by one parent, all of these things could result in the child feeling isolated, alienated, and have psychological distress. Now, there are many forms of child mistreatment or maltreatment. So there's physical abuse. And I want to differentiate the difference between corporal punishment and physical abuse. Not every time you spank your kid is it physical abuse, but even when it's not physical abuse, it has psychological effects. Can you imagine all the more so when people are physically abusing their kids, hitting them, beating them? Child neglect, it could be that's not taking care of the needs of a child, whether it be physical, education, or emotional. We also have psychological abuse or emotional abuse. These are where instead of hitting the child, you call them names, belittle them, tell them they're never going to amount to anything, things of that nature. We also have sexual abuse, right? That speaks for itself. All of these are forms of maltreatment. Now, it's important to understand abuse, neglect, and maltreatment occur, and it's not one singular factor that results in being more likely to experience child maltreatment. There are a whole host of contributing factors. One's culture is going to predispose you at being more or less likely to experience these adverse childhood events. One's parent and the internal developmental characteristics of the child. Now, but child abuse, neglect, and maltreatment severely affects the child. So it affects their emotion regulation, being able to properly express their emotions, filter things, withhold impulse. It affects their attachment or bond that they have with those around them. It affects their ability to establish healthy friendships and romantic relationships at later points in time. And I just popped out of the slide so you could see the rest of the bullet point. But it also affects their psychological well-being, such as all the things we talked about: anxiety, depression, substance use, delinquency, and so forth. All right. Now, sibling relationships. It's important to know that kids will fight. Siblings will fight. They'll be at each other's throat at times, and that's okay. At this point, they'll have frequent conflicts. You can help them navigate that. So a parent intervention could be beneficial and help them navigate the fight. Don't necessarily stop them from being at each other's throat, but teach them how to navigate conflict. Now, in terms of important characteristics, we look at emotional quality, familiarity and intimacy, or closeness and variation. Now, birth order. Alfred Adler suggested birth order affected personality. And to a very small degree, it's linked with certain personality characteristics. However, birth order and personality is way overblown and way overstated. And, he talked about the first child as being the hero and having advantages. He talked about the middle child as being sort of forgotten, and the youngest child as being more of like a mascot. And being an only child actually can be positive. So some of the things he said about birth order is not exactly correct. Now, let's talk about the changing family, right? In the 1950s, the expectations were very different than today, right? In the last 70 years, things have changed, right? So we tend to have families where both parents are working. And working parents, if you have both parents working, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can produce positive experiences, but it also can produce negative experiences. We also have changes as it relates to divorce. Divorce is far more common today than in the 1950s. There's less stigma. And we tend to see in general that children of divorce tend to show poorer adjustment than children in intact families. However, the one thing I will tell you is that just because in general they show poorer adjustment does not mean you should stay in a toxic marriage. If the marital problems are directly affecting the well-being of a child, in that case, it could be advantageous to get divorced. And ultimately, if there is a lot of conflict and people are staying together, that could have more psychological damage than actually getting divorced. So when we look at the percentage of single parent families, the United States relative to other nations is number one, right? So it is pretty much an understanding that Many kids are going to grow up in single parent homes for some period of their life. They might be in blended families in other periods of their life. But it's fairly common in the United States, up to about 1 in 4. And we also have to talk about the changes in parent structure. So to date, we've been talking about mothers and fathers, which could come across as a dismissal of the effectiveness of parents who are gay and lesbian. And what we find from the research is that gay and lesbian parents have very few differences in the outcomes of their children than heterosexual parents. So, what does the research say is that children who grow up in gay and lesbian households are just as productive, just as psychologically sound, just as healthy. There's no greater risk for their children to identify as part of the LGBT community. A lot of mythology has been put out there to block gay and lesbian parents from having kids, but it's actually just falsehood. And we see that 20% of lesbian and 10% of gay men report being parents. So it's changing. We also see some families are affected by culture, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. So our culture is always in flux. There's a debate about whether psychologists should have to have continuing education based on cultural factors. And I say, because cultures are by definition dynamic, we should have it, right? And if you want to treat families, it's important to understand that the cultural value systems can be blended or changed due to globalization. Ethnicity affects their differences in family structure based on ethnicity, parenting based on ethnicity, and many other factors. And we could see differences in family outcomes based on low and higher socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status is linked to academic achievement at a later point. And then we talk about peers, play, and television. So when we talk about our peer group function, we talked about that as your gender factory, but it also teaches us how to socialize, right? So it provides us the ability to have some kind of comparison outside of our family, right, to see right or wrong or differences. And that's absolutely necessary. Having friends and peers is necessary for healthy, normal socio-emotional development. Now, developmental changes, we talked about there's greater same-sex playmates in early childhood and middle childhood. In adolescence, it changes, but until then, we tend to stay within our own sex for playmates. We also tend to see an increase in frequency of playing with one's peers with age, so that's good. So again, what is a friend? A friend at this point is someone to play with, right? But it's important to understand the feedback we give our kids is linked to social competence and social acceptance. And our peer relation and friendship is linked to our attachment and parents' marital quality. So parents play a very strong impact on our friendships. Now, play is very important, right? So there are different theories on what play is and what its function is, but play in general is a pleasurable activity that you do for its own sake, right? So that's what play is. And there are different theories. So Freud and Erikson said it helps you deal with anxiety and conflict. Piaget said it helps you develop cognitive development. Vygotsky, who's more socio-cognitive theory, says it provides a great setting for cognitive development. And Berlin says it's, satisfies our exploratory drive. So there are different types of play, right? So in infancy, we talk about sensory motor play, repetitive acts. I think I talked to you about that with primary or circular reactions, I think I said. But in addition to sensory motor practice play, we have symbolic play, and symbolic play tends to blossom at this point because of the imagination, because of the increased mental representation, right? So we want to encourage pretend play and imaginative play or symbolic play. Now, we also have social play, which is interacting with one's peers. We have constructive play, which is engaging in self-regulated creation of a product, like playing Legos or something. And then we have games, which is activities that are for pleasure and have specific rules. So we talked about peer relations, we talked about play. Now let's talk about television. Television can be good, can be bad. But what we know is that television is a very strong influence in childhood. So there's a lot of modeling that occurs. And we see that children are watching anywhere between 2 to 4 hours of television a day. And that has just gone up because now people are watching screen time through other means like phones and tablets and things of that nature. So it's gone up. And television can teach us good things or bad things. So if you were to watch aggressive television, you're more likely at this point in your life to imitate the behavior you saw. So if you watch Power Rangers, you're going to role play Power Rangers in the backyard, and you're going to kick and punch, and you're going to fight one another. If you watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it might be engaging in pro-social behavior, right? So I wouldn't tell you that the television, throw it out the window, but I want you to think about how that affects children and development. So that is our lecture. So I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to stop the recording. Till next time, everybody.